Well, I had a bit of a nasty surprise when I went to check those bowls that I roughed out in January. Quite a few of the largest bowls of each cord set had split right alongside the tenon. I'm not entirely sure why that happened, but I've got to figure out a way to save these now. So what I'm going to do is I'll do one to test it first, but I'm going to mount it on the lathe and turn the bottom surface of that tenon flat so that I'll be able to clamp it down to a sled and make some cuts on the table saw. So now I'm going to basically I'm going to set up, get a piece of plywood that's probably about that wide. I want pretty much all of the tenon to be on the plywood, but I want the plywood to extend far enough out past I want a piece of plywood that's will reach from here to here and then be long enough to give me good registration against the table saw fence. So it needs to be at least 8 inches wide, but this is not necessarily the largest bowl that I've got this problem with, so I think I will make it at least 10 inches wide, and then probably 18 inches the other way. Then I'll make some kind of a framework on it that will let me set that on plywood, overhanging the edge, and then have an arm going across that I can clamp some pressure down, and then be able to run the edge of the plywood against the table saw fence, and I'll make a cut where that crack is and glue in another piece of wood. So I'll try and find a piece of plywood. I'll get the jig made up and then I'll be back. Okay, well, it's a couple hours later and I've finally got my jig done, I think. And rather than try and reinvent the wheel, I decided to take the beam off of my glue press and use it as the clamping device. So I just built this little platform here, and I put 3/4 inch all thread rod, which is the same thing I used to support the beam on my glue press, and I spaced it the same as my glue press. So I have the beam there. I put this piece back here just to try and stiffen it up, because that's only a piece of plywood. As soon as I start exerting pressure here onto something, the ends are going to want to bend up. This is probably not going to, it's so far back that it's probably not going to do a whole lot of good, but it's not going to hurt. What I'm going to be doing is setting that on there. When I was making the jig, the last thing I did, which was actually just before I turned the camera on, was I measured the distance from front to back of that base piece of plywood, measured the width of it there, and It was about 12 3/8, so I set the rip fence on my saw to 12 1/4, and I put this side against the rip fence and ran it through to cut this edge parallel to this. So I know that my cut line is going to be parallel with that side against the fence. My cut line is going to be parallel to this edge, so I can reference off of that. Now, depending on where I set the rip fence, it'll be in or out. Like I don't want to be cutting wood off the jig, so I want my cut line to be overhanging. And I don't want to have to screw this all the way down until it's pushing on the bottom of the bowl, if it would indeed even reach. So I'm going to use something as a spacer there. Something I intended to do and almost forgot. Since I'm only going to be exerting force in one place, it would be possible for this to rotate as I'm trying to cut if there's too much resistance to the cut. So I'm actually going to glue a piece of sandpaper on there just to increase the friction so that it will be less likely to try and rotate on me. Okay, so this is just a piece of 80 grit sandpaper, and I'll glue that on there, flush with the edge so that it will increase the friction and prevent that from turning. So I'm just going to put some spray adhesive on the back of this and glue it down. And I don't want to be spraying spray adhesive right around my camera, thank you very much, so you're not going to see that. Since I'll probably only be using this on larger bowls, I went on the assumption that they would all have at least a 3.5 inch tenon on them in diameter, and I put the center of these uprights 1.75 inches back from the ends, which is half of 3.5. So that theoretically, if the center of the bowl was here, a 3.5 inch tenon would be just flush with the outside. Now I need more than that sticking out, so I'm going to actually have it shifted, and I'm not going to have the clamping pressure directly over the center, but hopefully it will be alright the way to do it. I'll find out. This is all completely off the cuff, I guess. It's not something that I've ever done before, so it's more or less an experimental. What's that like? Okay, that actually should be alright, because I'm not going to be cutting that far up the bowl. So let's just see. I don't suppose it makes that much difference if it's centered or not. so that is bending. I have already exerted enough pressure to make the bottom bend. That's better. Not nearly as bent, and that seems to be gripping it fairly well. So I want my crack to be parallel to this edge, and it looks like it's pretty close. So my blade height will be from the bottom of this to the top of the crack. It would appear to be about 2 inches. And that's just about what my blade is set at right now, so I'll leave it alone. So I'm going to take this over to the table saw, put this edge back here against the fence, and make a pass through and see what we've got. And what we've got is not at all what I intended to do. So looks like I'm cutting deeply enough. Unfortunately, I cut way over. I forgot to measure the offset, and I cut it without changing the fence from what it was when I ripped this. So I made my cut just skimming this edge, and so I'm going to now have to put a much wider piece of wood in here. It's not a huge deal, but it's irritating when you forget stuff like that. So I'm just going to make a pass, move the fence over 1/8 of an inch, make another pass, move the fence over 1/8 of an inch, make another pass, until I've eliminated that crack, basically. Okay. So let's see what we've got here. So I wound up having to take about 5/8 of an inch there. Almost exactly 5/8 of an inch. That's actually not a bad thing, because that will let me get in here with chisels to clean up any ridges. If the saw blade left any ridges, it won't give me a good tight glue joint, so I'll probably want to clean that surface up before I glue a piece in there. So I think actually that's fine the way it is, so I'll take it out of the fixture. And it felt quite solid in there. It didn't feel like it was trying to move at all. And I didn't cut into my vacuum chuck. It was high enough up the side. So I'm going to say that jig worked out quite well, actually. So I was using a combination blade, but it gave me a pretty clean cut. I don't think I need to do anything to the sides of that to give me a good glue joint. I just need to cut a piece that will fit that exactly. So I'll cut it slightly oversized and hand plane it and test fit and hand plane it until it fits in there. The bottom surface there is got some ridges from the parallel saw cuts. So I will, not sure if I got a shoulder plane that's narrow enough to go in there or not, but I'll try and clean that surface up to the point where I can get a good glue joint on there. And then it's the point where you got to decide, are you going to try and put in a piece of wood that matches the wood that's there and try and hide the fact that you've done something, or are you going to put in a piece of wood that's something completely different and makes it obvious that you've done something. I have never had any luck with finding another piece of wood that matches the grain closely enough, and the glue joint always shows anyway, so I tend to put in a contrasting color piece of wood. So I'm probably going to put a piece of maple in there. So at this point I'm going to say that my jig was a success, and I'll start working on getting a good enough surface there to glue to without having any visible gaps in the joint. So I'm not going to be able to do that here, and I'm not going to try setting the camera up someplace else. So I'm going to be doing that off camera.